few ideas stand in such staunch opposition to the basics of our current neoliberal society as social Darwinism. In our society, both the modern left and most of the right like to think that we are all somehow equal. Be it because the differences in human merit and capabilities are environmental, in a case of the left, or that we were all created equal by God, or that our actions alone determine our merit, in a case of the right. To question the very assumption that human cultures and beings are in this way equal, or that their merit is determined purely by their actions, is a heresy for most of the modern left or right. In this video, however, I'm going to risk and present to you the heresy of social Darwinism. If you are easily offended, perhaps it would be better for you not to watch this video. Social Darwinism could be in a nutshell described as a theory, which states that human groups and races are subject to the same laws of natural selection as Charles Darwin perceived in plants and animals in nature. According to the theory, which was popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the weak were diminished and their cultures delimited while the strong grew in power and cultural influence over the weak. Social Darwinists held that the life of humans in society was a struggle for existence ruled by survival of the fittest, a phrase proposed by the British philosopher and scientist Herbert Spencer. The social Darwinists, notably Spencer and Walter Bagehot in England and William Graham Sumner in the United States, believed that the process of natural selection acting on variations in the population would result in the survival of the best competitors and in continuing improvement in the population that would, as time progresses, more fit into current environment. Societies were viewed as organisms that evolve in this manner. To fully understand what this all means, we need to firstly understand the very basics of the natural selection and Darwinism. Evolution of the species is not any conscious process, it does not have any goal. The process of evolution is a direct consequence of two selection processes. The first one is the Darwinistic environmental selection, the latter one is asexual selection. Darwinistic selection is actually pretty simple. To pass your genes further, first you need to survive in your environment. It is thus perfectly logical that the beings, which are more likely to survive in an environment, because of their characteristics, would be promoted by this selection. To give you an example of such a process in practice, let's imagine the following scenario. You are a fish, living in a river. One day the factory next to the river polluted it with lead. Most of your species living in a river are going to die out within the next few weeks because of lead poisoning. However, in your genome, little mutation occurred. This mutation causes you to have a higher tolerance for lead. Because of that, while the rest of your species are dying, you have managed to survive. It is obvious that now only those of your species have survived that had the mutation that had the similar effects to yours. Now in population there exist only those of the species that have the higher tolerance for lead. The sequence selection is a sexual one. It could simply be described as how effective you are at producing offspring. The more desirable your traits are for the opposing gender in case of mammals, the more likely you are to reproduce. The better your genes are at surviving in the current environment, the more likely your offspring are to survive and successfully reproduce too. Darwinistic survival of the fittest does not mean the survival of the strongest or the smartest, contrary to what some think. It simply means the survival of those specimens that are more likely to pass these two selections in the environment in which they live. If the current environment promotes the survival of the weaker or least intelligent specimens, then these specimens will be more likely to pass the first Darwinistic selection and obey visually, later sexual selection. Now we know that the theory of Darwinian evolution works in practice. I think that we all can agree on that, as it is simply a fact, and probably no one watching this video is a creationist. So now the question remains, does it work in the case of humans, in the same manner as in the case of the animals? And if yes, does it mean that in fact social Darwinists are correct? To understand if social Darwinism is true, we need to objectively verify the following statements that are the basics of it. 1. Does both environmental and sexual selection occur in a case of human species, in the same manner as in the case of other animals? 2. Does natural selection affect the creation on hierarchies in human society? 3. Does natural selection affect the achievements and performances of entire human groups? 4. Are some human groups inherently better in the current environment than others? 5. Are weaker human groups naturally eliminated by, or assimilated or dominated by the stronger groups? Let's begin with the first question. Both environmental and sexual selection affect the humans in the same manner as other animals. One example of recent natural selection in humans involves the ability to tolerate the sugar, lactose, in milk. In most parts of the world, adults are unable to drink milk because their body switches off the intestinal production of lactase, an enzyme that digests the sugar in the milk, after weaning. Among Indo-European populations as presented on the map, most of the population is lactose tolerant, while in most Central and South African countries, that percentage is a small minority. This Darwinistic selection occurred few thousand years ago. When the humans domesticated cattle and other milk-giving animals, those individuals in the population that were lactose tolerant had a higher chance of surviving famine. This resulted in much higher survival rates, and across centuries those in the population that were lactose intolerant simply died because of hunger. This is a perfect example of Darwinian selection. In the case of the sexual selection, one only needs to look on the rates of women all over the world, willing to date a short guy, to understand that it occurs too. Of course, in the USA, as we can see, this percentage is much higher than in many other countries because of, for example, different average height or environmental factors, but it is undeniable that all over the world most women prefer tall men over short ones. Now up to the second question. Does natural selection affect the creation of hierarchies in human society? Again, the answer is yes. Here are the examples to prove my point. In the US population, about 14.5% of all men are 6 feet or over. Among CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, that number is 58%. The CEO phenomenon suggests that people favor tall people. And research has shown that in general tall people, well, have better lives. By Rob Mayer for McCombs Today. Wait a second here. The height is mostly a genetic factor. It is true that diet and other environmental factors affect it. But the environmental factors cannot alone explain such a huge difference in height between the population average and people at the top of social hierarchy. This simply means that being tall is somehow beneficial in climbing across the hierarchies, as it gives man certain advantages. Those advantages might be, of course, insignificant in the current environment, but they were significant in the past. This means that being tall was or still is beneficial in acquiring wealth and high status for the individual. This alone proves that some genetic traits and natural selections affect the creation of social hierarchies. This also answers the third question: does natural selection affect the achievements and performances of entire human groups? As we can clearly see, being higher affects your chances of acquiring a high status. Being higher also affects your combat capabilities. People who are taller are also, on average, stronger and better in melee combat. This gives a tribe of people of higher height an advantage over the tribe with shorter men in combat. This automatically proves that natural selection affects the achievements and performances of entire human groups. This also proves that in certain environments, some groups or races, because of their genetics, are inherently better than others. In an environment of medieval Europe, melee combat is extremely important for the survival of the group. Thus, for example, Norse people, who were on average taller than the Anglo-Saxons, were inherently better at fighting and were able to dominate genetically inferior people with the same level of technological development despite being outnumbered. This is of course gross oversimplification, but it nevertheless proves the point. Finally, the last question. Were human groups naturally eliminated by, or assimilated, dominated to the stronger groups? And again the answer is yes. Many of the crimes perpetrated against the developing world were a result of the natural forces that define the world. In other words, there are stronger cultures, races, there are stronger societies, and by stronger I mean more fit to survive and thrive in the current environment. For this discussion, let us remove the notions of morality and ethics from the equation, selective tools of invocation anyhow, and look at social Darwinism from a purely social and cultural standpoint. For the social Darwinist, colonialism and imperialism are justified under the premise of might makes right. The colonizers have developed a culture, through a combination of geography, opportunity, ability, and pure providence, that has led to a dramatic evolution in how said culture operates. One only needs to look at how the British Empire exploded in power from the end of the Napoleonic Wars to the Great War itself. By a subtle combination of Enlightenment ideals, industrial development, increased military power, and more dominating ideals in how the world should be run, Britain was able to rule 10 million square miles, 26 million square kilometer, of territory that encompassed over 400 million people into the administration of the empire. We're talking about a nation that had a foot on every continent, a say in every affair. relations with every tribe imaginable, no serious rival internationally, and uncontested maritime naval supremacy that allowed her to enjoy what colloquially became known as Pax Britannica. Now, was this due to simply luck or by the very design of British culture, putting a premium on intellectual development and independent entrepreneurship, or the simple smile of God upon her? Most likely a mix of both, but we cannot discount the nature of man itself, the will to dominate, to compete, to be the top dog in all fights. It is simply a part of human nature and cannot be discounted from discussion. The ideas of might makes right and survival of the fittest are alive and well today, whether it is obvious to the observer or not. Whether it is fair that some cultures benefit from the grace of providence is immaterial, that is simply the odds and you make of them what you will. In reality, this all is very simple. The weaker group will always be dominated by the stronger one. It doesn't have to be total physical domination or enslavement, but for example cultural or economic domination. This simply proves the Darwinistic nature of human competition. Friedrich Nietzsche had famously said, "You can tell much about man's character by how much truth he can tolerate." This is especially true in the case of social Darwinism. The very basics of it put the entire worldview of our modern Western culture in danger. The problem is, however, far more sinister than that. Ignoring the basics of natural law will have far worse consequences than the identity crisis that we clearly can observe in the West right now. As our culture clings in desperation to the ideas of liberty, equality and harm reduction, that are essentially fairy tales, other cultures are not sleeping and instead they start to outperform us. Europe's share in global GDP is declining rapidly, our individual productivity is stagnating, our collapsing birth rates are resulting in the steady decrease of the people in the productive age. The Flynn effect is the substantial and long-sustained increase in both fluid and crystallized intelligence test scores that were measured in many parts of the world over the 20th century. However, since the late 20th century, our IQ is declining too, and now both USA and Europe are struggling with the so-called reverse Flynn effect, that is, steady and systematic decrease of cognitive abilities across the population. No matter where the one will look, he will find the ugly truth. We are losing and degenerating, be it across the economic, genetic or cultural domains. We had ignored the Darwinistic basics of nature and now we are paying the price of it. Instead of natural laws, we based our entire society on the premise of the so-called ethics and morality based on harm reduction, but those ethics are fully subjective while the natural laws are not. Both facts and nature do not care about our feelings and morality. Ironically, the forces of both the modern right and left had forgotten that the social customs, traditions and morality have no value on their own. The morality and pronomian social customs are nothing more than the Darwinistic adaptation to our society. It is not a coincidence that most successful high cultures embrace things such as monogamy or patriarchate. They are simply beneficial to the group or the ruling class in the current environment. Cultures that do not possess such effective social norms are in a losing position from the start and are simply exterminated or integrated into the cultural structure of a more fit culture. This is why one may not encounter things such as matriarchal societies or highly developed societies practicing the so-called free love, instead of arranged marriages. Our Western culture in that regard is an abomination, and the one as we now can clearly see after the sexual and cultural revolution of 1960s, a failing one, and actually the reasons for such matrimonial and social failure are again Darwinistic ones. The sexual selection in humans is based upon the desirability of traits in the environment that no longer exists. Our primitive little brain still thinks that we are hunter-gatherers living in small tribal communities. But the Neolithic Revolution changed the entirety of our environment, not to mention the Industrial Revolution. Our instincts of sexual selection are incapable of successfully leading us to select the traits that are really the best for current environment. Thus, all successful societies had created norms that put the control over sexual selection in the hands of the relatives or institutions instead of the individual, who would base his sexual decisions on primal instincts and the drug called love. Parents of a child were and still are usually more capable and rational than their child. Thus they based their matrimonial decisions on things such as wealth, status, honor of a family or the intelligence, when it came to choosing the partner for their child. This on average resulted in better sexual selection than letting it to the now obsolete Mother Nature. Darwinism, in the case of human societies, explains a variety of things, but above anything else it explains how and why the social hierarchies and norms are being created. The story of Western civilization up to the 20th century thus was a story of social Darwinism in practice. 121 years ago, the West in a collective effort crushed down the spirit of Asia in a Boxer rebellion in China. The Asians, however, have learned their lessons, and now, as we are entering the beginning of this what would come to be our own century of humiliation, they are flourishing again. Ironically, despite the fact that many 19th century intellectuals tried to use social Darwinism to justify racism. Racism is in direct opposition to social Darwinism, as it leads one to overestimate the ability of his own race, while at the same time it underestimates the capabilities of other supposedly inferior races. This is an evolutionary disadvantage. When we, the collective West, were in our prime years because of our racism, we underestimated the Asians. Now, in a time where we are declining, they are showing us that we were fools. Thus now the ugly truth about social Darwinism, it is presenting itself so much by social dynamics that you simply cannot ignore primitive human nature, as we are simply a bunch of monkeys, who are capable of understanding a little bit about more abstract things. If we pretend that we are not animals and that we are in fact exceptionary in some way, we in our pride, will have to pay the price, and this is exactly what has happened in the case of Western civilization. Spencer applied the idea of survival of the fittest to so-called laissez-faire or unrestrained capitalism during the Industrial Revolution, in which businesses are allowed to operate with little regulation from the government. Unlike Darwin, Spencer believed that people could genetically pass learned qualities such as frugality and morality on to their children. This view turned out to be partially correct, that is because indeed personality traits are partially dependent upon genetics. These personality traits affect things such as personal morality, political views and group affirmations. However, such learned qualities are not passed down upon offspring directly and are rather the byproduct of similar genetic characteristics, not genetically inherited traits. In this aspect, Spencer is thus incorrect. Spencer opposed any laws that helped workers, the poor, and those he deemed genetically weak. Such laws, he argued, would go against the evolution of civilization by delaying the extinction of the unfit. Another prominent social Darwinist was American economist William Graham Sumner. He was an early opponent of the welfare state. He viewed individual competition for property and social status as a tool for eliminating the weak and immoral of the population. For social Darwinists, the free market is a preferable economic system, because it lets the environment sort people out naturally and promotes traits that correlate with wealth and status accumulation, such as, for example, intelligence that positively correlates with earnings and finance management. At the same time, the competitive nature of the free market not only produces constant innovation as a business entities are trying to outperform one another to gain an advantage on a market and therefore increase their profits, but also such environment automatically promotes those who succeed and highly disadvantages the unfit, that is mainly poor and disabled. In other words, because people at the top of the social hierarchies are on average genetically superior, that is, they thrive the most in current environment, they will have naturally a higher chance of passing a Darwinian sexual selection and will be able to attract better partners. This in a long term will lead to accumulation of both resources, status and those positive genes in the family, actively promoting it. If such family will due environmental factors fail dramatically, then it simply means that it is no longer fit for current environment and thus will be rightfully demoted in a social hierarchy, that is in laissez-faire capitalist societies strictly correlated with wealth, or even straight up naturally exterminated from a gene pool. This system thus actively encourages not only socio-economic and technological growth, but also it results in better genetic adaptation of population to the current environment as time progresses. At the same time, traits such as intelligence that are mostly inherited genetically can result in better adaptation to different or changing environments. At the same time, those at the bottom of social hierarchy, according to social Darwinists, because of highly meritocratic nature of free market society, still have a chance of achieving a better place in a social hierarchy. They argue that if their inherent genetic qualities will be fit, then despite the great difficulties, they will climb thanks to their merit through the social hierarchy. This results in even greater genetic competition between different specimens and thus means that only those people who really possess superior genetic qualities will climb up the social ladder. This also puts additional pressure on already existing elites to improve, because if they fail to do so, then they would be simply replaced by more fit specimens from the lower social classes. Also, those who would be unable to support themselves would automatically be eliminated from a gene pool. This free market system also works as a perfect population control mechanism, as human beings are inherently a commodity. Thus, if the demand for humans would be smaller than a supply, then naturally the least productive specimens would die as a result of hunger, illnesses, cold, or who else knows what. The same goes for a situation when, due to economic prosperity, the demand for humans is higher than supply, then people would automatically be a more valuable commodity, thus the standard of living would automatically increase, which in the long term would result in population growth, until the demand would reach supply. This free market economic mechanism will, according to social Darwinists, prevent both under- and overpopulation, as a population would always be adequate to current economic capabilities of society, such as food production. As social Darwinist rationalizations of inequality gained popularity in the late 1800s, British scholar Sir Francis Galton, a half-cousin of Darwin, launched a new science aimed at improving the human race by ridding society of its undesirables. He called it eugenics. Galton proposed to better humankind by propagating the British elite. He argued that social institutions such as welfare and mental asylums allowed inferior humans to survive and reproduce at higher levels than their superior counterparts in Britain's wealthy class. This view isn't actually incorrect in our society, because indeed poorer people have more children, and man in the IQ range of 75 to 90 are most sexually active and have the biggest amounts of sexual partners, which means that they are by Darwinian standards, most evolutionary successful. This may contribute to reverse Flynn effect in a West. The question remains, are low IQ, poor people more evolutionary successful, because traits that they have are more useful for passing the natural selection than their wealthier counterparts, or they have more sex and children because of artificial human intervention, that happens at the cost of the entire species? Galton's ideas never really took hold in his country, but they became popular in America, where the concepts of eugenics quickly gained strength. Eugenics became a popular social movement in the United States that peaked in the 1920s and 1930s. Books and films promoted eugenics, while local fairs and exhibitions held Fitter Family and Better Baby competitions around the country. The eugenics movement in the United States focused on eliminating undesirable traits from the population. Proponents of the eugenics movement reasoned the best way to do this was by preventing unfit individuals from having children. During the first part of the 20th century, 32 U.S. states passed laws that resulted in the forced sterilization of more than 64,000 Americans, including immigrants, people of color, unmarried mothers, and the mentally ill. Eugenics has many critiques. Putting aside the moral and philosophical arguments, the main arguments against it, based on actual biology and genetics, are based on the recessiveness of certain genes and the underestimation of environmental factors by those who advocate for eugenics. These arguments are of course true, as things such as intelligence are largely environmentally dependent, and negative recessive genetic traits would be still prevalent in a population, even after the long multi-generational implementation of strict eugenic policies. Eugenic policies may also lead to a loss of genetic diversity. Further, a culturally accepted improvement of the gene pool may result in extinction, due to increased vulnerability to disease, reduced ability to adapt to environmental change, and other factors that may not be anticipated in advance. This has been evidenced in numerous instances, in isolated island populations. A long-term, species-wide eugenics plan might lead to such a scenario because the elimination of traits deemed undesirable would reduce genetic diversity by definition. Of course, as supporters of eugenics like to argue, the science of genetics have increasingly provided means by which certain characteristics and conditions can be identified and understood, which should be available to implementation of at least partial accurate eugenics police. However, given the complexity of human genetics, culture, and psychology, at this point there is no agreed objective means of determining which traits might be ultimately desirable or undesirable. Some conditions such as sickle cell disease and cystic fibrosis respectively confer immunity to malaria and resistance to cholera when a single copy of the recessive allele is contained within the genotype of the individual, so eliminating these genes is undesirable in places where such diseases are common. In short, eugenics, despite being in certain cases legitimate by any biological standards, such as for example in cases of harlequin ichthyosis, it is greatly controversial if we really possess sufficient genetic knowledge to apply them to more complex cases, and that of course without taking any ethics into account. This video probably enraged a large number of people, as I in many cases was not only explaining core ideas of the social Darwinians without any contempt, but also in many cases I had agreed with their claims and provided evidence for such an opinion. This directly goes against not only the ideological beliefs of most people but also their moral ones. I think that 6 moral foundations theory could explain this well. Basically, people's beliefs are much more based on emotions and moral principles than reason. As one may see, political beliefs correlate differently with moral foundations. For example, liberals in our society focus much more on harm than conservatives. If we put social Darwinism on this chart, their harm reduction would probably be close to zero. This may appear as not as big a deal on paper, but basically our Western culture is the most obsessed culture with harm not only now but also across all of history. This leads social Darwinism to be basically against not only individual moral foundations of most people but also of all of our culture, which by the way is despised by them. To look objectively on social Darwinism, one must essentially be amoral or extremely rational in a way. Many of social Darwinists' claims have a reasonable base in science, and their main assumptions that alongside environmental factors, genetics and Darwinism are extremely important in a formation, and rivalry between human species and groups is simply true. The problem is that solutions proposed by the social Darwinists are simply by standards of our morality evil. It is not necessary that they are wrong but simply completely opposed to our morality. The direct result of implementation of this system would be a creation of dystopian, highly competitive, laissez-faire capitalist society, in which individual human life would be worth little and most important aspect of life would be reproduction and competition with both outside and inner groups. This society would probably work just as social Darwinians of 19th century had imagined, but I highly doubt if people would be happy. However, ignoring the more animalistic and Darwinian part of human nature will have tragic consequences for us, that would probably be far worse than this kind of society and may even endanger the survival of our species. The solution is thus to find a way to implement Darwinism in our society in a way that would not result in complete collapse of our values, morality, culture and effective creation of the caste system. It is much easier said than done, and to be completely honest, I have no idea how we can do that. However, we as a Western civilization had already overcome much greater challenges in our past, so I believe that we would, despite great difficulties, find a way to solve this problem too. We have both material resources and the spiritual ones of intellect, will, beauty and culture to overcome much greater struggles. We simply need to wake up, unite and use them. And with that perhaps positive and optimistic message, we had arrived at the end of this video. If you, by some miracle, hadn't been offended enough to despise me and have actually enjoyed this content or found it interesting, then please consider liking and subscribing to a channel, to make Ducci feel proud. See you next time and have a great day.